What if I told you the most horrifying human experiments in history didn't happen in secret bunkers or dystopian fiction, but in broad daylight under a government's full approval? Today we're uncovering Unit 731, Japan's nightmare science lab, where ethics died and unthinkable horrors were masked as medical research. While we're here, if you're into history that they don't teach in school, click that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell. This is one video you'll definitely want to talk about later. So, it was the early 20th century, and Japan was in the grip of imperial ambition. Fresh off victories in wars against China and Russia, the country saw itself as a rising superpower and everyone else as inferior. This national superiority complex wasn't just cultural, it became institutionalized, shaping military policy, foreign conquest, and eventually one of the darkest chapters in human experimentation. After World War I, the Geneva Convention of 1925 banned chemical and biological warfare. Most nations agreed to play by the new rules. Japan, however, quietly opted out in practice. They saw biological warfare as an opportunity. Enter Shiro Ishii. A military doctor and ambitious researcher, Ishii convinced Japan's military leadership that biological weapons could be their secret advantage in the next Great War. In 1932, he was given full authority to establish the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Sounds harmless, right? It wasn't. Behind that sanitized name was a deadly objective: to develop and test biological weapons on human beings. The first experiments began at a converted fortress in Manchuria called Zongma Fortress. Civilians, mostly Chinese, were taken as test subjects. These people weren't sick or dangerous. They were farmers, laborers, sometimes even children, chosen solely for their convenience and disposability. Once imprisoned, they were deliberately infected with diseases like plague and typhus. Some were starved or dehydrated. Others were dissected while fully conscious. No anesthesia, no chance of survival. The goal? To study the effects of illness and trauma in real time. It was small-scale horror, masked as research, and it was only the beginning. This entire operation was backed by a government that believed its enemies weren't just inferior, they were inhuman. That mindset laid the foundation for what Unit 731 would become. A system of cruelty, justified by science, enabled by nationalism, and ignored by the world for decades. By 1936, the small-scale horrors of Zongma Fortress weren't enough. Japan's ambitions and atrocities needed more room to grow. The Imperial Army fully backed Shiro Ishii's vision, and with that support came a rebrand. The Togo unit quietly transformed into Unit 731, now operating under a new, more official-sounding name, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Translation? We're going to build a death lab and make it sound like a health clinic. That death lab was built near Pingfang, a suburb of Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. It spanned over 2 square miles, with more than 150 buildings. It had everything: research labs, hospitals, barracks, power plants, and deep underground tunnels where the real horrors happened. Even the layout was a lie. Visitors passed through a spotless, fake welcome center. Meanwhile, the prisoners were smuggled in through underground tunnels so no one would see them arrive. The whole place was a trap wrapped in a disguise, but the darkest evolution wasn't architectural, it was psychological. Inside Unit 731, language became a weapon. Human test subjects were no longer called prisoners. They were called maruta, the Japanese word for logs. The lab itself, officially nicknamed the lumber mill. Researchers joked about cutting logs and moving timber. It was dark humor with a strategic purpose: dehumanize the victims until they were no longer seen as people at all. And it worked. The use of euphemisms helped hundreds of researchers, guards, and soldiers detach from what they were doing. If you call it science and you stop calling the victims human, you can convince yourself it's not murder, it's progress. With full military support, unlimited funding, and zero oversight, Unit 731 was no longer a research station. It was a factory of death, and business was about to boom. At its core, Unit 731 was a playground for military sadism. Victims, mostly Chinese civilians, but also Koreans, Mongolians, Russians, and even Japanese dissidents, were subjected to experiments that make horror movies look tame. Weapons testing came first. Victims were tied in formation, while live grenades were thrown into their midst to study blast patterns. Others were burned alive with flamethrowers, or lined up and shot with different guns to measure bullet trajectories. Human crash test dummies, except no one got out alive. Then came the disease trials: plague, typhus, cholera, syphilis. Victims were infected on purpose, then dissected alive, yes, without anesthesia, to observe internal effects. Some were locked in sealed rooms filled with plague-infected fleas. Others forcefully infected through needles or sexual assault. Environmental testing also checked off. Prisoners were dunked in freezing water until limbs froze solid, then shattered to study bone damage. Some were dehydrated to death under heat lamps. Others were locked in pressure chambers until their eyes popped or lungs collapsed. Surgical experimentation was even worse. Healthy organs were removed for fun or swapped around just to see what would happen. arms amputated, reattached to the wrong side, stomachs removed and intestines rerouted to throats. Pure Frankenstein madness. Pregnancy experiments were beyond comprehension. Female prisoners were forcibly impregnated, sometimes by guards, sometimes by other prisoners at gunpoint, just so fetuses could be dissected at various stages. And it didn't end inside the facility. Unit 731 launched field tests, releasing plague bombs on Chinese villages, infecting entire populations, then marching through the corpses to collect data. Some of it was for weapons. Most of it wasn't. It was evil with a clipboard. By 1945, Japan knew it was losing the war, and desperation is a terrifying motivator. In one last act of insanity, the Imperial military drafted Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, a plan to send kamikaze pilots across the Pacific and drop plague-infested fleas on San Francisco, turning the U.S. into a biological war zone. The only reason it never happened? America dropped atomic bombs first. With defeat looming, Unit 731's leaders scrambled to erase the nightmare they'd built. Prisoners were executed, often by poison or bullets. Facilities were burned to the ground. Records were destroyed. Every effort was made to erase the evidence, because they knew the world wouldn't see their work as science. They'd see it as what it was, war crimes of the highest order. But then came General Douglas MacArthur. Leading the post-war U.S. occupation of Japan, he got wind of Unit 731 and what the researchers had learned. And instead of dragging Shiro Ishii and his team to trial like at Nuremberg, MacArthur offered them immunity. The deal? Turn over your biological warfare data, and we'll pretend this never happened. Ishii agreed. The U.S. got pages of research soaked in innocent blood. The Soviets, not wanting to miss out, held their own war crimes trials. But even they handed out suspiciously light sentences, 2 to 7 years in labor camps, for crimes that normally would have ended in a firing squad. It's strongly believed they, too, made a behind-the-scenes deal for the data. So in the end, the world's two most powerful nations didn't expose Unit 731. They bought it. Justice didn't just fail, it was traded. For decades after World War II, Unit 731 wasn't history, it was rumor. A whispered conspiracy, a crazy theory about a secret Japanese lab where unspeakable things happened, records were hidden, and the official line, it never happened. But the truth has a habit of clawing its way out. In the 1970s and 80s, a small group of Japanese historians refused to let the silence win. They dug through archives, tracked down military records, and collected testimonies. The Japanese government, not thrilled. When one historian tried to publish the findings in a textbook, the Ministry of Education told him to remove the section entirely. So he did the unthinkable. He went to the U.S., where declassified records from the immunity deal sat quietly gathering dust. In those files were the names, the experiments, the data, the undeniable proof. With that, the lie unraveled. By the 1990s, Japan finally acknowledged that Unit 731 had existed, but details remained vague. Sanitized. No official apology, no criminal convictions, just nods toward a horror too large to fully admit. Then in 2018, a breakthrough. The Japanese government publicly released the names of 3,607 individuals who served with Unit 731. Researchers, technicians, guards, most long dead or vanished. But it was something. A record. A fact. A start. So, yeah, not your average history lesson. Unit 731 wasn't just some rogue lab in a far corner of a forgotten war. It was a government-backed, military-funded horror show masquerading as science. And it got buried, whitewashed, and bought out by superpowers who valued data over justice. But we remember, and we name it. So if this made your skin crawl, good. If it made you sick, better. Never forget, Unit 731. And always listen to Dante Dread. If you made it here, congrats. Hit that like button if you learned something horrifying. Drop a comment with the wildest part you didn't know. Subscribe if you want more real stories the textbooks forgot. And share this with someone who thinks history is boring.